comrades. Having the privilege of working on the Gelfand case changed my life dramatically. First in September 1980 when I was introduced to it, and even more so in March 1982 when I began taking the depositions. I was a 27-year-old civil rights lawyer, 1 year out of law school, just hired at Fisher & Most, a firm specializing in First Amendment cases located in Century City on the west side of Los Angeles, next to Beverly Hills. Over lunch, my boss, Barry Fisher, asked me whether I wanted to work on a case that turned on who killed Trotsky. I said, sure, but didn't they get the guy? And he said, that's right, but there's a backstory that people are very interested in. Barry introduced me to Alan Gelfand, who gave me a stack of case documents, including Judge Felter's recent order denying the motion to dismiss, his letters that were discussed yesterday by Comrade Nerissa, and several large formatted publications on security in the Fourth International, which I now know were designed by David King. The one that stuck out most to me was how the GPU murdered Trotsky. Maybe some of the younger and the newer comrades haven't seen these in person, but I mean, here's the Sylvia Franklin dossier. They're huge, bold, and they attract a lot of attention. And I remember over the next few weeks, heads would turn as I walked in and out of this building's main lobby, carrying them back and forth from home. Their text photos and supporting documents were riveting, even though I had little background in socialist politics. These publications describe the Trotskyists in Europe that supported the left oppositionists trapped in the Soviet Union, the genocide then in progress, and the GPU murders facilitated by Etienne, Mark Sparowski, and others, which I concluded from this material must have included Lola Estreen, who later became Lola Dahlin. I read about Sylvia Callan, Franklin Caldwell, Doxey, and the other agents that were infiltrated by the GPU here and abroad as the SWP established the American section of the Fourth International. These publications describe Trotsky's heroic final exile in Mexico, the May 24th, 1940 assassination attempt, the disappearance and murder of guard from the United States, Robert Sheldon Hart, and the brutal August 20th, 1940 blow struck by Ramon Mercader, who at the time had passed away fairly recently in Havana after his 1960 release from a Mexican jail. Security in the Fourth International gave context to understanding the machinations of the then recently deceased Joseph Hansen, his contacts with the GPU before the assassination, and then with the American consulate in Mexico City and the FBI in New York afterwards. Gelfand's correspondents asked about these publications, and the SWP responded with evasions and threats. A few days later, Gelfand brought David North and Larry Porter to our office. In our first conversation, North explained the Tim Woolforth, Nancy Fields story. I remember asking him to explain Pabloite revisionism, which was entirely new to me. I'm still processing that response. That evening, Barry Fisher took us to a nice dinner, and we were off and running. Here's a photo of Comrade North and me taken around that time. This is a little later. Now, because the opportunity might not last, the very first thing that Gelfand and Fisher did, and this was really before I was fully on board with the case, was arrange for Sylvia Doxey to be subpoenaed and deposed in Chicago through local attorney Edward Stein. Alan Gelfand questioned her on September 22nd, 1980. This kind of happened so quickly that the SWP did not have a chance to try to block the deposition before it happened. Their attorney, Margaret Winter, and political committee member and Carleton graduate Larry Siegel attended for the SWP. Stanley Wright, who would represent the United States throughout the case, attended for the Justice Department. And then for this deposition only, out of all the depositions that occurred in this case, and there were over 20, there was an attorney from the FBI. His name was Grant Harmon. After confirming a few details of her early life, including her marriage to Zalman Franklin, Doxey claimed to know nothing about his affiliation with the Communist Party or his reason for going to Spain. She evaded and deflected Gelfand's questions. She claimed 231 times that she had no recollection, including whether she was recruited in Chicago by Louis Boudin's to infiltrate the SWP. This testimony is typical of page after page after page. Question, is it your testimony under oath that at no time did you ever have any discussion with any individual at the Drake Hotel concerning your infiltrating the Trotskyist movement? Answer, oh God, I can't recall anything of this sort. Question, are you willing to deny that under oath? Answer, I will say I can't recall anything like that. That's right, I can't. But I can't remember things clearly either. And under oath, I'm afraid to say yes or no. How can I when I can't remember? Now, these events, this point's been made several times in the school, were 40 years old for her at the time. The events I'm describing to you right now are 45 years old, and I don't have any trouble remembering them. After his initial questioning, Gelfand discovered his tape recorder that he had tried to record the morning session with malfunctioned, but he was able to fix it over the lunch break. And we have a brief sequence of his questioning during the second round that is in this excerpt where she's responding to questions about the Control Commission. And this testimony is typical of what she did the whole time that Gelfand was questioning her. So you'll now hear, comrades, the voices of Alan Gelfand and Sylvia Doxey.
Who came to your defense during this meeting?
What?
Who came to your defense during this meeting?
I can't remember any details.
Did anybody come to your defense?
I wasn't really accused of anything. What do you mean, come to my defense?
Well, how are these accusations dealt with? Were you asked any questions?
I can't remember any details. It's 40 years ago, probably, or 35 years ago. I can't remember. I just know that somebody brought some accusations and we discussed it.
Now, after the morning session, then Doxey went to lunch with Siegel and the SWP's attorney, Margaret Winter. And then they came back and there was another round of questioning. And I'll go ahead and play it. And I think the comrades will notice the difference in her attitude. So here's attorney Margaret Winter questioning Sylvia Doxey at the time.
Mrs. Doxey, from your testimony this morning, it became clear that for approximately the last 30 years or longer, the FBI and various agents of the FBI have been spreading rumors that you are some kind of agent.
Spreading rumors?
spreading rumors.
How do you mean?
Well, I believe that you
That's a
testified.
point of question.
Well, this is cross-examination.
The question's ambiguous, Mrs. Doxey's in a case she doesn't understand.
All right, there. Mrs. Doxey, you have testified that the FBI talked to you on many occasions and that there were innuendos from them, if not direct accusations.
Yeah, they were
that
quite
you were
nasty, I must say.
a Soviet agent. Is that correct?
I think so.
And
That was probably the main trend of their thought, that they were putting words into my mouth of this sort,
this went on
trying to.
for an extended period of time. Is that correct?
Yes, on and off for a long time, until now. It's unreal. Like I say, I can't believe it. I just can't believe it.
And you are aware and recall that you were previously aware of the charges against you by Louis Boudin's in his book.
Not completely. I'm very confused about this, but there must have been some charges of this nature, was why I was being harassed.
Now, in all these years of
That's all the conclusion I could come to.
in all these years of accusations and charges, was there ever, to your knowledge, any evidence other than these accusations by the FBI and by known stool pigeons like Boudin's against you? Was there
What do you mean by
That's beyond the scope of her knowledge and expertise.
I said to her knowledge.
Oh, to my knowledge, no. I don't see how they could be.
Were you ever an agent of the Stalinists?
I told you that I wasn't.
Were you ever an agent of the Young Communist League?
Never.
Were you ever an
I'm
agent?
sure never.
Were you
I
ever
couldn't have been.
an agent of the Communist Party?
I don't see how I could have been.
Were you
The
ever,
way I feel about them, I couldn't have been.
were you ever an agent of the Soviet secret police?
Oh, I'm sure not. A person would know something like that, wouldn't they? You think so?
As this questioning went on, this GPU plant who facilitated the assassination of Trotsky and has the blood of humanity dripping from her hands, really hammed it up for Winter and Siegel. And I'll just play one more clip, I think, which is very revealing.
When you look back on your membership in the Socialist Workers' Party over 30 years ago, how do you view it now? How do you feel about
About those years,
those years?
sometimes I feel they were the only productive years of my life, to tell you the truth. It was very satisfying to a young, idealistic person. I feel guilty that I don't do anything about the condition of the world today, but I don't know what to do, and I don't trust anybody anymore. Even the Socialist Workers' Party, I don't know what they are, who they are. I've been so out of touch with everything, but I feel this world is so polluted and it needs so much work. And I feel guilty that I don't even try to write my congressman about the hazardous waste, because I'm just too lazy to. I do think along these lines. It bothers me.
Can you recall how you felt about the Socialist Workers' Party when you left the party over 30 years ago?
I felt very guilty about leaving. I felt like I was being very selfish, but I just felt like I had to have time to myself. I was tired, I was lonesome. I needed a change in my life. I wanted to go home. I really did. My mother's such a good cook, and I was lonesome. I really was, for a change in my life again.
Did you feel hostile to the party when you left?
Oh, of course not.
it goes on in that vein for quite a while. Here, incidentally, is the certified envelope of the transcript from Chicago, the notary certification, and we had to take it out of this envelope and present it to the court as evidence, which was done. The next thing that we did was to subpoena Ed Heisler, who was then living in Los Angeles, because he had just recently exposed himself as an FBI agent for informant for 9 years within the SWP, who then moved up into SWP leadership. Heisler, during his deposition, testified incredibly that he stopped working as a government agent once he joined the National Committee of the SWP. He denied any knowledge whether other SWP members were agents. We were not able to get anything from Heisler that advanced the fundamental issues in the Gelfand case. But we did run into the testimony that Heisler gave on December 16, 1975, when he was the national chairperson for the SWP presidential campaign of Peter Camejo before the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, which was then considering Gerald Ford's nomination of George Bush, the senior one, as CIA director. This exchange, which I've edited a little bit for clarity, took place with the chairman, John Stennis, a foul, old-school segregationist Democrat. And it gives some insight into the relationship between the U.S. government and its agents. Stennis asked Heisler, "Do you favor opening up all the FBI files?" Heisler responded rather than yes, "Which files do you have in mind specifically?" And then Stennis said, "FBI files, all of them, every one, whatever they have." And Heisler then beat around the bush. And Stennis said, "If you cannot answer yes or no, that's all right." Now, on September 22nd, coincidentally the same day as Doxey's deposition, the SWP followed Felser's lead by filing a motion for summary judgment under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 56, claiming that the case should be dismissed because Gelfand had no evidence. The SWP also set Gelfand's deposition and demanded he produce documents, initiating their red-baiting campaign to discredit him because of the First Amendment protected support he received from the Workers' League, which is the predecessor of the Socialist Equality Party, and the International Committee. In October, Gelfand produced his documents and sat for a 2-day deposition. The SWP, while claiming its own First Amendment rights were under attack, attacked Gelfand for exercising his constitutional right to petition in this court for redress of grievances. Gelfand served his own formal written questions, which are called interrogatories, and demands for the production of documents. He asked the U.S. government directly to confirm whether the SWP leaders who engineered his expulsion were agents. Under Felser's order upholding Gelfand's claim, those interrogatories should have been answered, but we were under no illusion that they would be. The fight against summary judgment is documented in the second half of the Gelfand case, Volume 1, and it's been referred to many times. On November 17, 1980, Gelfand filed his first brief in opposition. At this early stage, with no discovery other than the Doxey and Heisler depositions, Gelfand had only publications of Security in the Fourth International and his correspondence with the SWP leadership. While we argued that this evidence established Gelfand's expulsion was accomplished by U.S. government agents in the SWP, we also argued that Gelfand's democratic rights to first conduct discovery, as required by federal rules of civil procedure 56F, needed to take place. Barry Fisher represented Gelfand at the first hearing on summary judgment before Judge Felser, which occurred on January 7, 1981. I sat at the council table. Felser responded to Fisher with unbridled hostility, saying, quote, "Mr. Fisher, this is a lawsuit." "Yes, Your Honor." "You can sit in your room or at your typewriter as long as you want and think that the reason that this is happening is because of thus and such and so, but you now are on a motion for summary judgment." "Yes, Your Honor." "There isn't one shred of evidence whatsoever that the persons who engineered as you all of this were government agents. There isn't any evidence. You can't prove anything." I'm talking about nothing. There is nothing at all there now. But I'm saying, Mr. Fisher, you have no evidence as opposed to some or a little. You have none. Now I'm advising you of the following. You are that close to being out of court with respect to them. I do not want to minimize the danger you are in because you have not got that nexus between the person who made these decisions and the infiltration. You just don't have it yet. Now, despite these threats and bluster, Felser did not grant summary judgment, which would have resulted in a judgment for the SWP and sent the case to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Instead, she continued the hearing, but she stayed all discovery. She wouldn't allow any more discovery to take place, which imposed an impossible contradiction. On the one hand, Felser demanded that Gelfand present enough legally admissible evidence to establish what the federal rules call a, quote, genuine issue of fact, unquote, to be resolved at trial on his claim that government agents expelled him from the SWP, while at the same time denying him the power to compel the SWP and the US government to produce that evidence. In other words, having affirmed Gelfand's fundamental First Amendment right to conduct political activity in the SWP free from government interference, Felser denied him the democratic right to vindicate that principle in federal litigation under the rules of civil procedure. As a conscious representative of the ruling capitalist class from a liberal background, Felser recognized Gelfand's core First Amendment claim. At the same time, however, she instinctively defended the state, protecting government agents from exposure, even as she declared their actions unconstitutional. This duality permeated the case and effectively disabled Felser from adjudicating the actions of the SWP defendants under the political criteria of a revolutionary party. Gelfand filed a supplemental brief in opposition to summary judgment on May 17th. This time, however, he had the International Committee's new evidence that Jack Barnes, Larry Siegel, and at least 10 other high-level SWP leaders had attended Carleton College and were groomed by Hansen through the Fair Play for Cuba Committee for SWP leadership. July 17, 1981 was the second hearing on the SWCP's summary judgment motion. Felser started up where she left off, berating Barry Fisher. Well, we have finally come to the point where I must tell you that the motion for summary judgment is going to be granted. I have many, many doubts about this case as we have gone along, but I still do not see any connection here. There are all kinds of suspicions, there is conjecture, there are accusations, some of which are real and some of which may be real. But there is no significant connection between the defendants here such that I can find there is any ground for liability. Nothing has been shown by way of facts that would indicate there is liability on behalf of these defendants to this plaintiff. Felser then appeared to relent a little bit. Well, the court has to give you some discovery before it decides that the motion for summary judgment is to be granted, because you are almost out of court. I doubt seriously you're going to find anything, but I will now order the defendants to sit with you and discuss what they can give you. Then I will reset the motion for summary judgment with no more papers. He, and she's referring to Gelfand, has to be given the opportunity to see what those documents are with respect to the expulsion and certainly other discovery, which I recall that bears on this issue. If he can't produce anything, then he is out of court. Now, all Felser would allow at that point was an agreement that the SWP and the US government would formally respond to the written discovery that Gelfand had served on them more than 8 months before. No depositions were allowed. The SWP's written discoveries were incomplete and evasive, their responses. Those from the government consisted solely of objections based on the informant's privilege. The refusal to admit or deny that any of the SWP members involved in Gelfand's expulsion was an agent. Although we knew the government would never identify its SWP agents, to keep the case moving forward, we made a motion to compel them to answer to U.S. Magistrate Benetta Tesopoulos, a lower-level judge who hears discovery matters. And then we had to appeal her inevitable ruling upholding the privilege to District Judge Felser. The SWP did nothing to support our efforts to force the U.S. government to disclose its agents. Instead, the SWP renewed its motion for summary judgment. So this timeline, which I'll just mention briefly, shows that for 2 years and 8 months after Gelfand filed his case, he was deprived of his ability to develop it through, principally through depositions, and that things kept being put off until what became a very fateful hearing on his summary judgment motion on February 1st, 1982. This was the last court appearance in the case by Barry Fisher. After some back and forth on the status of the motion to compel discovery from the government, which was then before Magistrate Tesopoulos, Felser told Fisher, quote, "I have nothing whatsoever in this record of an evidentiary nature that will keep this plaintiff in court, nothing." Then she shifted gears. "I will place the motion for summary judgment off calendar. You take whatever discovery you wish to take, but the discovery cutoff date will be 3 months from now, May 3rd. She then threatened that if Gelfand did not produce evidence, he was, quote, going to be paying all the costs and, quote, liable for damages under the tort of malicious prosecution. This latter threat directed to us as attorneys as well. Comrades, at this point, we finally had an opportunity to address the historical issues raised by security in the Fourth International. We could question live witnesses at depositions and dig deeper into the GPU penetration of the Trotskyist movement and its cover-up. We could press the SWP on Hanson's lies and machinations, Healy's big lie, and the phony verdict declaring that security in the Fourth International was a shameless frame-up. But 90 days for legal procedures stretching over the entire country is not much time. Our backs were literally against the wall. This would be our only shot. And frankly, Alan Gelfand and I, with intense support from Comrade North and the International Committee, gave all we had to make the most of it. After months of planning, scheduling, and serving subpoenas, in early March, Gelfand and I traveled from Los Angeles to New York City for the first round of depositions. On the way, we stopped at the Workers' League facilities in Michigan. I remember Comrade North stressing the historical importance of the work we were about to undertake. He told us that the coming weeks would change history and us as well. He was right on both counts. Now, I need to get a little bit personal here. Despite working on this case for 18 months, I had not broken with bourgeois liberalism, and I had not been won over to Trotskyism. That would happen over the weekend of March 6, 1982, after I commenced the 4-day deposition of Jack Barnes in Manhattan. As soon as I began questioning Barnes, his appearance, demeanor, and strange answers made me think he had to be a government agent. He came off to me like a zealous Marine Corps sergeant assigned to impersonate a Marxist and run a party of quislings. The more Barnes testified, the more clearly I felt this. Barnes could not recall whether he was a member of the Young Republicans or Young Democrats in high school. He confirmed his political career began after a Carleton College professor set him up with a Ford Foundation grant for a Cuba trip, and he joined the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. When asked about Sylvia Agaloff, Barnes was flippant, ignorant, obnoxious, and provocative. He did not know Lenin's age at death or the date of Trotsky's assassination. In regards to Agaloff, Barnes responded, "I'm not a pornographer. The details of their relation were boring." In fact, he found all the details of Trotsky's assassination boring. Barnes acknowledged that the FBI flooded the SWP with agents, but testified they could be helpful and active. He added that GPU agents have rights, including Mark Borowski, the murderous Etienne. Rather than condemn the Stalinists who murdered the old Bolsheviks and purged the revolutionary movement of its most promising young cadre in the Soviet Union and overseas, Barnes testified that, quote, "there has never been anything as degenerate as the International Committee in the history of the socialist movement." Barnes acknowledged that Peter Camejo, the SWP's 1976 candidate for US president, who played a key role in suppressing Gelfand in the Los Angeles branch, had abruptly left the party. Barnes testified that it would be, quote, "stupid," unquote, to inform the membership. Because the Fausto Amador connection had recently been published, I asked whether it was possible that Camejo's sudden resignation had to do with an intelligence agency. Barnes responded, quote, "what if he resigned because he was a three-headed calf," unquote, and, quote, "it's possible you are a robot and not a person," unquote. I give these few examples among many from a deposition that lasted 4 days to give some idea of what a distorted individual Jack Barnes is. That such a person could lead what was supposed to be a revolutionary Trotskyist movement is absurd. Barnes made me realize that what I had read in Security in the Fourth International and had myself written in brief after brief was all true. The US government was running the SWP as a massive anti-working class intelligence and disruption operation. There was no doubt in my mind. I was so overwhelmed that I became concerned for my personal security and did not sleep for several days. That such a monstrosity could develop brought to light the historical necessity of the capitalist state to defend its own class interests by suppressing the revolutionary vanguard of the working class embodied in the Trotskyist movement. With the exception of Vaughn O'Brien, who I'll get to in a minute, Barnes was the only witness deposed who described discussing with Hansen his GPU contacts. To reconcile the absurd and contrary explanations in Healy's Big Lie, Barnes described Hansen's GPU meetings as by chance, but, quote, "Joe was to give the impression that he was available to meet with the GPU to pass valuable information," unquote, adding, quote, "the GPU was too suspicious to go for the bait," unquote. Barnes testified it would be, quote, "idiotic to expose the identity of the GPU agent and that Trotsky, quote, did not care about his name." Barnes was also the only witness who testified that he spoke with Hansen about the series of US government contacts after the assassination. Barnes said Hansen met with US consulate official Robert G. McGregor, quote, "a couple of times," but when pressed, and as comrades know, the documents show at least 5 meetings, not the one that Hansen acknowledged, testified, "Who cares?" Barnes acknowledged that after returning to New York from Mexico in 1940, Hansen maintained contacts with U.S. agents. He agreed the government documents published by Security and the Fourth International were legitimate, and that Hansen met with Special Agent B.E. Sackett at FBI offices on multiple occasions over the course of a year. When asked whether that information appeared in Healy's Big Lie, the document to which the SWP referred Gelfand, Barnes testified, quote, "It's not there," unquote. Now, yesterday there was a discussion about democratic centralism being a two-way street, and this Barnes testimony really highlights that it was just a one-way street in the SWP. I asked, did anyone in the party have a right to those facts? Answer, no. Did you have a right to those facts? Yes. Why are you any different? Because I am elected National Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party and a member of the political committee. And you decide which facts members are entitled to? Answer, in many cases, yes. In what cases? In cases where the elected, democratically elected bodies use facts and carry out work and then decide to who and how much of it is to be discussed exactly and precisely. Who besides you yourself participated in the decision to withhold facts from Mr. Gelfand? There was no decision to withhold facts from Mr. Gelfand. There was instead a decision not to give any special consideration to Mr. Gelfand beyond and above anyone else. Mr. Gelfand was making requests that you provide him with certain facts, among other things that you contend he did. Isn't that correct? Mr. Gelfand had access to all of the facts that every other member of the party had access to, but not access to all the facts that you had. Correct. Do you have a right to withhold those facts from the membership of your party? That's correct. Do you have a right to withhold these facts from the workers' movement? Correct. Do you have a right to withhold these facts from the Fourth International? Correct. Barnes denied there was any evidence whatsoever that Sylvia Caldwell was a GPU agent. He called her self-sacrificing and described the deposition taken by Gelfand as clearing her, although he never reviewed it. When asked what would be the significance of her being a GPU agent, Barnes responded, quote, "None whatsoever," unquote, adding, quote, "What's the significance of the fact that you are a secret baby eater," unquote. Comrades, after listening to Barnes for 4 days, my life would never be the same. I believe to this day that we proved Gelfand's case then and there. Now, we continued to depose the national leaders of the SWP, Larry Siegel, Doug Janess, and Mary Alice Waters, Peter Camejo, all, except for Camejo, graduates of Carleton College, and all involved in Gelfand's purge from the party. We also deposed the local leaders, Pearl Chertoff, Bruce Marcus, and Joel Britton. Without going into detail, none testified to having any knowledge whatsoever about Hansen's contacts with the GPU, with the U.S. consular officials in Mexico, or the FBI in New York City. Each defended Sylvia Caldwell, and each testified that Gelfand's questions were disruptive, agent-baiting slanders answered in Healy's Big Lie. In addition to these 7 SWP defendants, we deposed 8 non-party witnesses, each dating back to the founding of the Fourth International in 1938. Each had to be located, scheduled for a nearby location where they were living, and served personally with a subpoena. Let me just show you. Here's the subpoena, the original New York subpoena for Vaughn O'Brien. Here's the one for Albert Klotzer. We had to do these for all 8. when we did, the SWP filed what's called a motion for a protective order to block each of these depositions from going forward. Now, incredibly, comrades, this includes that of Mark Sporowski, the filthy, traitorous GPU mole who, it was already established, was directly responsible for the murders of Erwin Wolf, Ignaz Rice, Rudolf Clement, and his close comrade, his close friend, Leon Sedok. And when comrades think about the fact that the SWP actually went to court to block this man from being deposed by us, rather than support the opportunity to confront this murderer, they should consider that these people I just named were his age. Leon Sedok, I think, was a couple years older, and Rudolf Clement several years younger than Sporowski himself, who was at the time 74 years old. These Trotskyists had been dead since 1938 at that point, for 44 years. That's how long, the world had been deprived of their efforts and their leadership. And yet the SWP would go to court and say that our effort to depose this man was part of a Healyite slander campaign and harassment that, as Barnes said, GPU agents have rights too. Now, we had to litigate this, and Magistrate Tassopoulos ruled against the SWP's request for a protective order on March 22nd, 1982. That cleared us to depose SWP founding member Morris Lewitt, George Novak, Farrell Dobbs, and George Weissman, as well as Trotsky's former secretary, Jean Van Huysenoort. When we took their depositions, for the first time, I heard GPU consistently expressed by its European pronunciation. I think it's German, but they all said GPU every time. Took me aback at first, and then I started saying GPU because they all did. But none of them, not one of them, had any inkling that Hansen, who I think was 27 years old at the time and had just joined, had been in contact with the GPU in New York. At the time, he was also back and forth from Koyukon and participating in Trotsky's secretariat and guard. None of them knew anything about that. Only Van Huysenoort would grant that Sylvia Caldwell was a GPU agent. The others defended her, and they knew her personally, and they knew what she had been doing. And they knew that she had left after a control commission. But they claimed not to know about Budenz's book. They claimed not to know about her indictment as a co-conspirator of Robert Soblin. And this includes George Weissman, who was a young man at the time. Weissman was the person who actually circulated the so-called verdict for signature by all these people, including each of the other witnesses, declaring security in the Fourth International a shameless frame-up. Weissman knew nothing of the security in the Fourth International materials published, nor did anyone else who signed or supported this verdict. Now, we did depose Felix Morrow. That was one of our more interesting depositions. Morrow was a member of the political committee at the founding of the SWP in 1938, editor of the Militant, author of the very fine book that all comrades who haven't read it need to read, called Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Spain. He was deposed in New York on March 24th, 1982. Although Moro broke with revolutionary politics after being expelled along with the SWP's then attorney, Albert Goldman, in 1946, and he subsequently pursued a career in publishing, he came off far more principled and honest than all the witnesses who had remained in the SWP. Moro confirmed that the interview he gave Security in the Fourth International during its investigation was accurate. He emphasized he didn't know anything about Hansen being in contact with the, as he said, GPU, or the US consulate, or the FBI. And when investigating the assassination, the SWP knew the GPU had done it. They placed no reliance whatsoever on the US government, none. Because the US government was just as much their enemy, and he would go to jail not a year or so later under the Smith Act conviction. Morrow rejected this concept of agent baiting. He said that the SWP was highly concerned about GPU agents because they necessarily were recruiting from the ranks of the Communist Party. Morrow testified that he personally exposed Floyd Cleveland Miller, one of the militant's writers, as a GPU agent. Miller was later listed along with Sylvia Doxey as an unindicted GPU co-conspirator in the Soblin indictment. Morrow estimated 5 to 10 other lower-level members were exposed as GPU agents during that period, and that the consensus in the SWP leadership was that Robert Sheldon Hart was a GPU agent. Morrow said at deposition that the leadership would never send a, quote, meathead, unquote, that was his term, like Hansen, to meet with a GPU agent, and that Cannon and Shachtman would never have approved such an operation or written it down. He completely rejected that. He was there. Trotsky and the SWP's policy was always to publicize and expose the GPU whenever possible. Had the leadership known that Hansen, quote, chanced to meet, unquote, a GPU agent who tried to recruit him, that fact would have been exposed in the pages of the Militant. Morrow testified he knew Louis Boudin's quite well. In fact, they had been in parties together prior to earlier splits. And he didn't doubt Boudin's identification of Caldwell as a GPU agent. Now, finally, and one of the really kind of dramatic points was Morrow, when I explained to him how just 2 weeks before, Magistrate Judge Tsopoulos had denied the SWP's protective order to block the deposition of Zborowski from going forward, he just found that absolutely incomprehensible. He knew who Zborowski was. He knew the crimes that this man had committed. He knew the significance of forcing him to testify. And he found it, his word was, quote, incomprehensible, unquote, that they would try to block that. Now, another interesting deposition was that of Albert Glotzer. Glotzer was actually, and I don't think this was mentioned earlier, he was a court reporter by trade, and he actually reported, he wrote down in shorthand the proceedings of the Dewey Commission in Coyoacan, Mexico. He was an active SWP member until he split with Max Shachtman in the 1940 events. He was hostile during his deposition, but at the same time, somewhat straightforward in his answers. Glotzer was the branch secretary when Sylvia joined the SWP in Chicago. He said, and he was insistent on this, that she presented herself as Sylvia Caldwell. That was her name. He said, no, Sylvia Caldwell was not given to her as a party name. She said her name was Sylvia Caldwell. Now, this was a point in time when she was already married to the Stalinist Zalman Franklin and had changed from her maiden name of Callan. He said his initial contact with her was, quote, weird, unquote, because, quote, she didn't seem to know why she was joining, unquote. Glotzer was shocked, that was his word, when he saw her working for James Cannon in the New York National Office a few months later. Now, 7 years later, in 1947, he and Shachtman got what they considered to be reliable information through their own political contacts, that the FBI had developed information that Sylvia Caldwell, Cannon's secretary, was a GPU agent. And following the principle, an injury to one is an injury to all, and common defense against police agencies, even though they were hostile to the SWP, they made an appointment and had a 15-minute meeting with James P. Cannon that Glotzer was present at. He said, we have this reliable information that your secretary Sylvia, actually Shachtman said it, was an agent of the GPU. Cannon said, thank you very much. And he was obviously, quote, none too pleased, unquote, in Glotzer's words. Glotzer had no doubt she was an agent, but he signed the verdict anyway. Now, in terms of getting new information during these depositions, which were just fascinating, we took the deposition of Von T. Irish O'Brien, who was Hansen's longtime friend, who was in the SWP briefly and served as a guard in Koyukon. Remember, point has been made during the school, O'Brien at the time was the only person cited by Hansen who was alive, who had personal knowledge about his GPU contacts prior to the assassination. And Healy's big lie included these excerpts from a supposed 1976 letter that O'Brien had written to Hansen to corroborate Trotsky supposedly telling Hansen to go to New York and, quote, take on a GPU agent, unquote. To keep Trotsky informed, Hansen and O'Brien purportedly communicated in letters between them using invisible ink and secret codes. I expected O'Brien to repeat this bizarre cloak and dagger story, denying that he made it up with Hansen. I was shocked when he gave the following testimony, and he said this as if he was reading from a script, but he wasn't. And I just want to read it for the comrades. When Joe was preparing to return to New York, he told me that he and LD wanted me to handle some correspondence between them, and it was very confidential, and that I was not to tell anyone about it. And for the record, I haven't told anybody about it until 5 years ago. Joe and LD had dreamed up a scam. Joe was to take, presumably, the only copy of The Life of Stalin to New York, hand-delivered, presumably, and when he got there, he was to look up the GPU, the Stalinist in New York, and tell them he was a disillusioned Trotskyist and that for $25,000 he would sell them the only copy of the manuscript on Stalin. And let me repeat, this was Trotsky's idea. Joe and LD had gone directly to the communist headquarters, which was just a block or two away from the SWP headquarters there, and told them that he had some important communications with one of their top people. And they set him up with someone, I never did get a name on it, and he gave the proposition, and the GPU agent said he would have to communicate with Moscow, and he set up another meeting. And they talked again, and it became evident, oh, and Joe had put this down as a precondition in this scenario, was he wanted $25,000 to buy a ranch out in Utah, you know, and he was not going to do anything to endanger Trotsky or divulge anything there. And as the 2 or 3 meetings took place, it became quite evident that they were not going to give him $25,000. All they were ever interested in was finding out what was going on in Mexico. And so Joe broke off the contact. So this was a scam to get money from the GPU for the Fourth International. That's right. It wasn't a scam to get information. No, they, meaning the GPU, were trying to get information from him. O'Brien testified that he kept this ripoff story to himself until the early 1950s when he ran into a former comrade, Pearl Kluger, who informed him that she was doing typing for Boudin's, and Boudin says your friend Joe Hansen worked for the GPU. Suddenly, all the pieces came together. Sylvia Caldwell was in the same GPU ring as Hansen, but the US government chose to maintain Hansen's cover because following the assassination, Hansen started informing for them. Hansen would have invaluable services to provide in the future. 2 weeks later, on April 15, 1982, Mark Sporowski appeared for his deposition, the one the SWP had tried to block, at the law offices of Altshuler and Berzon in downtown San Francisco. This was a historic moment for us. We knew who he was. This was the highest level GPU mole inside the Trotskyist movement ever confirmed and exposed. One who betrayed Sadov after years of the closest collaboration, as we've heard about. One who had the blood of Wolf, Clement, Ignaz Rice in particular, who he set up for machine gunning on a railway platform in Switzerland, dripping from his hands, and who knows how many others. And we finally will have the chance to sit across the table from him and tell him what we thought. He, after overcoming the SWP's effort to block his deposition, he provided a few family details, and then on the instruction of his attorney, James Larson, Sporowski invoked the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and refused to answer any further questions. Now, I made a series of statements, and this is a long excerpt. It's in the book. Our contention is that the Soviet secret police infiltrated the Trotskyist movement internationally on a massive scale during the 1930s. It is our belief that you were one of the agents who infiltrated the movement in Europe and in Paris. Other agents infiltrated the Trotskyist movement in the United States. And that's a particular concern to us because the Trotskyist organization in the United States was the predecessor and later the Socialist Workers' Party. We feel that many of these agents were operating within the Socialist Workers' Party and that you have knowledge as to their operations of these agents and perhaps to their identity, that this apparatus of the Soviet secret police of which you were a part was international in scope, and the fact that many of your activities occurred in Europe and many of the activities that we're interested in occurred in the United States does not necessarily mean that you don't have information which is reasonably calculated to lead us to the discovery of evidence as to the identity of agents operating in this country. We want to learn about the modus operandi of the Soviet secret police in order that we can evaluate evidence that we have that certain individuals who played predominant roles for a long time in the Socialist Workers' Party were agents of the GPU. When you came to the United States, we believe, with the aid of people who were members of the SWP and who were affiliated with the SWP, And we believe that those individuals may have been involved in the same secret police apparatus that you were a part of, that these individuals were longtime leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party, but were in fact Soviet secret police like yourself. And we'd like to probe your recollection of those events and obtain your testimony as to any knowledge you might have, because we believe that is reasonably calculated to lead to the discovery of admissible evidence. We believe that when you came to this country in 1941, that you continued to operate as an espionage agent for the Soviet secret police within the Trotskyist movement. And particularly, you were part of the same espionage ring, which included Jack Sobel, Lucy Booker, Floyd Cleveland Miller, Sylvia Callan, also known as Sylvia Caldwell, Franklin, and Doxey, and that you would have known about operatives within that spy ring, which were successful in penetrating the Socialist Workers' Party. We believe that you continued your activity on behalf of the GPU and the Soviet secret police until you were publicly identified as a Soviet secret police agent, in part by Alexander Orlov in 1954-1955. We believe that you have certain relationships with the government, which resulted in your eventually being tried for perjury and convicted and serving a sentence, and then being allowed to pursue your academic career. We also believe that you may have knowledge as to how the Soviet secret police agents within the SWP were turned by the US government so that they began to serve as agents for the US government against the Socialist Workers' Party and the Trotskyist movement. We believe that you may have knowledge as to how this turn, as I call it, took place, and as to the circumstances under which these agents, which I believe that you can identify, and which I believe include Joseph Hansen and other members of the Socialist Workers' Party, how these agents were turned and then were instructed by the federal government to train agents such as Jack Barnes, Larry Siegel, Peter Camejo, Doug Janess, and other FBI and or CIA agents of the US government, secret police agents of the US government, who entered the Socialist Workers' Party on a massive scale during the years beginning around the end of 1958 and continuing through the 1960s. Borowski, of course, did not change his position. The deposition ended. As the 74-year-old man shuffled out of the room, he suddenly approached me and he said, "Have you read Kafka?" before leaving with Larson for the elevator. He was no victim, I thought to myself. He victimized the working class. With the impending discovery cutoff, our effort to compel Borowski to testify would have to wait. While we pushed to accomplish as much as possible before the May 3rd deadline, the SWP continued to assault Gelfand's right to bring the case. They deposed Alan Gelfand 2 more days, grilling him about his salary as a public defender and his savings, his contacts with members of the Workers' League, and how much money was raised to support the litigation. They also deposed his attorney, Barry Fisher. They came up with nothing. With the depositions ongoing, we also had to press forward to compel the United States government to disclose whether Gelfand was expelled by its agents in the SWP. Although, as I said before, we never had an illusion the government would disclose its agents. That required an appeal of Tsouplos's ruling to Felser. Felser ruled on May 3rd, the discovery cutoff date, after reviewing a US government submission in camera, that is privately in chambers, that the informant's privilege allowed the US government to refuse to confirm or deny whether any named individuals involved in Gelfand's expulsion was its agent. After these busy 90 days of discovery, Los Angeles, New York, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and San Francisco, Felser made it official that Gelfand would get nothing directly from the US government. Of course, we never expected that to happen. We knew we would have to rely on the historical evidence to prove our case. Facing a judge who made clear 3 times she intended to grant the SWP's motion for summary judgment and throw the case out, we had to synthesize more than 10,000 pages from 15 depositions, 17 including Doxey and Heisler's, with the archival documents implicating Hansen and Sylvia Caldwell and the outstanding record Gelfand made within the SWP when posing his questions. Organizing such a brief presented significant unique challenges. Our team traveled to England to discuss the approach with Jerry Healy, Alex Mitchell, and others. But on arrival, we found they had nothing to offer. We returned and worked day and night out of the Fisher & Most law office to meet Felser's rapidly approaching June 28th deadline. Fortunately, Fisher & Most had the latest word processing technology from Wang. There were 2 workstations which we could use after hours. This was the height of luxury at the time, comrades, and there were no hard drives. It wrote to these 8.5-inch floppy drives. And believe me, this was a luxury to be able to use this instead of a typewriter. Because of other demands at the firm for using these devices, we had to do most of our drafting after hours. The key for us was placing Hansen's machinations and the stonewalling by the SWP defendants that Gelfand had encountered within its historical context, which meant explaining the life or death struggle of the Trotskyist movement and the working class more generally against Stalinism. Here are 2 pages from our original brief, which is reprinted in full in the book. Allow me to read. On the one hand, he, meaning Gelfand, is told that if he can prove that the leaders of the party are agents of the United States government, he will establish the violation of his constitutional rights. Yet the most straightforward method of proof, examination of relevant government documents and direct responses to questions aimed at government agencies, has been denied to him. It is within these limitations that plaintiff proves his case. The proof depends on an intricate web of circumstantial evidence, which leads inexorably to the nexus between the infiltration of the SWP by agents of the federal government and the expulsion of plaintiff. The facts of this case are embedded in great historical events. Their ever-widening spiral sweeps back into the past, embracing within its bounds an increasing number of individuals, including Trotsky himself and those closest to him during his last heroic exile. If a more direct and less arduous road to truth were available, plaintiff gladly would have taken it. Nonetheless, when fact is added to fact, and each is evaluated in its proper relationship to the other, the conclusion becomes inescapable that something is very, very wrong with the leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party. Agents can, perhaps all too successfully, conceal their duplicity for long periods of time. But inevitably, when they perceive a direct threat to their role as agents, the mask will be set awry. This case thus depends on the meticulous study of defendants' actions. Their conduct should be interpreted not as the conduct of typical individuals, but in light of who the defendants purport to be, the most faithful proponents and followers of Trotsky's highly principled politics. A legitimate leadership would have no difficulty in dealing with plaintiff's questions, in accordance with the Constitution of the SWP and the proud traditions it claims to represent. The questions would have been answered forthrightly and as completely as possible. Instead, plaintiffs' persistent but appropriate questioning about matters pertaining to party security created a crisis among the agents and forced them to show their hands. Had plaintiffs' actions warranted discipline, the leadership could have taken any necessary measures within the democratic procedures of the party. But the SWP defendants' efforts to silence plaintiff and to isolate him from the balance of the party's membership exposed the extinction of those very democratic procedures. Now, this excerpt that I just read succinctly states our approach to the entire brief. Believe me, we worked day and night on it for weeks. And with the technology at the time, it took hours just to print it out. It had to leave Century City, which is located on the Los Angeles west side, and despite rush hour traffic, be in the doors of the downtown Los Angeles Federal Courthouse before they locked at 4:30 p.m. on June 28, 1982. Larry Porter and I drove like madmen and got it filed just in the nick of time. Here it is, all 146 pages, including 67 footnotes. We explained what the depositions revealed, the contradiction, lies, and cover-ups. and how the SWP's response to Gelfand's legitimate questions contrasted with the history of their movement. We explained that the only explanation was that the current SWP leadership was groomed by Hansen, who himself was heir to the GPU apparatus infiltrated into by Stalinist parties into the Trotskyist movement to disrupt its operations and ultimately assassinate its leadership more than 4 decades before. The summary judgment motion came to hearing on July 12th at 10 a.m. Felser was clearly furious. The first words out of her mouth as I took the lectern, "Mr. Burton, let's discuss how many depositions you have taken since I permitted you to do that. And then who paid for these depositions? Now, just so the record is clear, I am asking you, who put up the money for the cost of the depositions?" As Alan Gelfand said to me last week, if this were a case between Ford and General Motors, the lawyer would not have been asked such a question. There was some brief argument. I, of course, refused to answer that question. Felser eventually said, "I don't think I can grant the motion for summary judgment." And for us, that meant that Gelfand had, in fact, produced evidence of a government takeover of the SWP. In any event, that ensured the case would continue to trial. This was a massive, massive victory. But after hearing more from SWP attorney Winter, Felser ruled that the Workers' League and the International Committee, and only those organizations, could not publish the deposition transcripts. Quote, "You are through with abusing discovery process. It is all over," Felser told me. When I protested, she said, "Mr. Burton, let's cut this short. You will go outside and work out the terms of this order. If you can't do that, you will come back this afternoon at 1:30 and I will do it for you." The gag order was entered the next day. We actually went through the process of redacting the deposition passages from the closing brief so it could be published for the working class. Here's a sample page. Here's my copy of the censored brief that was published. All the deposition passages were taken out of it. The gag order did not remain in effect for long, however. We immediately appealed, and after the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals indicated that it would review Gelfand's emergency motion for a stay pending full appellate review, Felser withdrew the gag order. The uncensored closing brief was then published. 2 matters that were still open at this point. The first was finishing the effort to compel Mark Zborowski to testify. And the second was to obtain the grand jury transcript that Doxy had provided, the testimony. To proceed against Zborowski, we first had to obtain an order from Felser relieving us from the discovery cutoff. So after what she just said, that was no certainty, but we in fact got an order on October 18th, 1982, reopening the discovery so we could pursue the motion to compel against Zborowski. That, of course, was over an objection by the SWP, who consistently, throughout the litigation, opposed every effort we made to compel testimony from Zborowski. We had to file the motion in San Francisco because that's where the deposition occurred. Zborowski's lawyer, James Larson, filed an affidavit that referred repeatedly to his collaboration with the SWP's legal team and argued that Gelfand's purpose in seeking Mr. Zborowski's deposition is to obtain information for use in a private war between political factions, thereby abusing this court's process. Now, Larson also raised a new ground, that Zborowski's testimony should be blocked because it threatened to expose U.S. intelligence agents in the SWP. On June 23rd, 1982, after Zborowski's deposition, but before the motion to compel, then President Ronald Reagan signed the Intelligence Identities Protection Act, making it a federal crime punishable by up to 10 years in prison for any person who knowingly discloses information which identifies a U.S. covert intelligence agent. Gelfand's motion to compel Zborowski came to hearing on January 4th, 1983, only 2 months before the trial date. That motion was before U.S. Magistrate J. Steele Langford of the Northern District. The following remarkable exchange took place. Magistrate Langford, suppose this witness were ordered to answer these questions, and he said, okay, Mr. A, B, C, and D are members of the Socialist Workers' Party, but I know for a fact from my past experience in dealing with them that they are, in effect, agents of the Central Intelligence Agency or the FBI, who were put in that party in an undercover capacity in order to infiltrate. I know this for a fact. These are their names. This is where they live. Here are their phone numbers. And some endeavoring reporter from the Washington Post picks up this transcript and decides to publish a book. And in short, these people have been exposed. Isn't what this act is all about? And my response, this, in fact, is what our case is all about. Well, wait a minute. I know what your case is about, but timing-wise, this particular enactment that I'm concerned about has just come out of the Congress of the United States. It's been signed by the president and says that everybody who does that goes to jail. So we then got permission to appeal his decision, because magistrate decisions on discovery can be appealed to the district judge, to bring it to Felser instead of a district judge in the Northern District. And we finally got it to her. And the hearing was on February 7th, 1983. And Felser said that she had some sympathy with our contention that this new law does not override Gelfand's constitutional claim that she had affirmed a couple years before. But then she very quickly and cynically denied the motion to compel. It was at this hearing, Felser, having never heard the European pronunciation or the Russian pronunciation used by anyone in any of the court proceedings, none of us had ever said it. She referred to the Soviet secret police as the GPU. The last thing we had was the Sylvia Doxey grand jury testimony. We knew at that point that she had testified to the 1957 grand jury that indicted Robert Soblin for Soviet espionage, and that she had been named as an unindicted co-conspirator in that, under her maiden name of Callan, in that indictment. This is the same grand jury that Zborowski lied to about not knowing Jack Sobel, and his lies under oath would later result in Zborowski's perjury conviction. I drafted an affidavit setting out our need for the transcript in light of the false testimony Doxey gave during her deposition, and attached multiple exhibits. We engaged the New York firm of Kornstein, Meister & Weiss to file the petition. And here are those papers. And so comrades can see the kind of effort we went through on that. Kornstein, Meister & Weiss paper. The SWP filed an opposition. And after what we had gone through with Zborowski, of course, that didn't surprise us, but I think that comrades should reflect on the fact that this was the personal secretary to James P. Cannon for 9 years, 1939 to 1947, 38 to 47, during which time she had access to everything Cannon had access to, maybe more, because she maybe kept some stuff from him. And that she then gave sealed testimony to the US government, which could only have been about the SWP during this crucial part of its history. And they went to court to keep it secret. that they didn't want to know what was being said. Now, we had a hearing on January 19th, 1983, before United States District Judge Robert Ward. And it was full of surprises, frankly. There was an assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case, David Hammer, and he made the following long statement, and I'm going to read it. I think it's important. Your Honor, I went through all the boxes in the possession of the National Archives on both the Jack Sobel case and the Robert Sobelin case. I also arranged for a special truck to have those boxes all brought to our offices, and they are now in our offices. I've only been able to find one transcript in those boxes, the October 7th, 1954 testimony before the October regular grand jury in a matter called United States versus John Doe, where Sylvia Doxey testified. It is my impression from going through those boxes that what in fact happened was apparently an ongoing 10-year investigation into various matters beginning in the late 40s, continuing on through 1962. And it is my impression what happened is simply the notes, the files, the grand jury transcripts were essentially compiled at some point and used to obtain various indictments. The indictment in 1957 against Mr. Jack Sobel, and the indictment in 1960, I believe, against Mr. Robert Sobelin. In any event, I have been unable to find any later testimony than the 1954 by Mrs. Doxey, notwithstanding the submission by counsel from Mr. Gelfand of a Freedom of Information Act document indicating there was a 1957 transcript. All I have is what I provided to Your Honor. Now, this I think is very important. I will say in conclusion, although I will not refer to the substance of this transcript, that I cannot see any continuing interest on the government's part or on the part of the public in keeping the testimony in this transcript secret. Two things jumped out. First, we did not know about this 1954 testimony. Second, the US government was not asserting any continued interest in secrecy, which should have made the release of the transcript automatic. Instead, because the SWP was opposing the motion, Judge Ward said that in his opinion, nothing within that transcript supports the plaintiff's contention in the pending case in California that the Socialist Party leaders are agents of any government. He cited Doxey's invoking the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination to questions about whether she attended the founding convention of the SWP, whether she was canon secretary, whether she corresponded with Mrs. Trotsky. There was much dialogue regarding searching for the missing 1957 transcript. Then SWP attorney Shelley Davis interjected. There's absolutely no connection between anything Sylvia Doxey may have said in the 1950s about alleged Soviet spying in the United States and any infiltration of the Socialist Workers' Party by the FBI and CIA in the late 1970s. Plaintiff has shown absolutely not one shred of evidence to make that connection. Before anyone goes to any more trouble or we go to the burden and expense of further litigation, I think that fact should stop this inquiry right here. The hearing continued. Judge Ward periodically mused about the contents of the 1954 transcript. For example, he said, quote, there was a great deal of interest expressed as to whether she met her former husband at the pier upon his return from Spain. Apparently she did, unquote. Of course, I understood the significance of that connection to Stalinism and Zalman Franklin, but Judge Ward obviously did not. I asked the court, if Your Honor could transmit the transcript in the court's possession now under seal to Judge Felser so that the motion can be renewed at trial or at an appropriate moment before Judge Felser so that she can make the relevancy determination. And again, Shelley Davis, the SWP lawyer, interjected. This is worse than general discovery. This is a pig in a poke. they don't have any reason to believe there's evidence of any value in these transcripts, and we would certainly oppose your transferring them. After some more back and forth about the missing transcript, Judge Ward agreed to transmit it under seal to Judge Felser. Once we were back in front of Judge Felser, another U.S. attorney, Linda Cromwell, who is in Los Angeles, handed Judge Felser the 1954 transcript in court during our pretrial conference on January 31, 1983. Felser said she'd review it and decide whether to release it. We had another hearing the following week on February 7th. That's the one where Felser said "Kepe-u" and affirmed the order on Sparowski. To our surprise, Cromwell appeared again. She told Felser that a second transcript had been located and turned over Doxey's testimony from the 1957 grand jury. It turned out to be dated June 18, 1958. Felser told me that her courtroom deputy, we all knew him as Bobby Flores, would be contacting us about their release. But we heard nothing about release of the transcript. When trial started on the afternoon of March 2nd, I asked, can we have the transcripts now? She said she had my request in mind. On March 4th, I questioned Larry Siegel. Is there any doubt in your mind whether or not Sylvia Caldwell was an agent of the GPU when she was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party? Answer, I have no doubt that she was not. I kept asking for the transcript. I kept being put off. On March 9th, I had the following exchange with Jack Barnes. Now, was it your opinion that at the time you received Gelfand's letter, there was no evidence whatsoever to indicate that Sylvia Franklin was an agent of the GPU? All the evidence was just the opposite. Her whole comportment, not only when she was in the movement, but everything that's happened since she left, indicates that she is exactly what she was, a loyal, hardworking, and model member of our movement. That's still your opinion today? Well, my opinion today is she is one of my heroes. One of my heroes. After the harassment and what she's been through the last couple of years, I would even feel more strongly about her character than I did then. After Barnes testified, we were asked about our final evidence. We put in all our exhibits. There were some objections, sorted out. She said, do you have any other evidence? I said, no. Plaintiff rests. She then handed Mr. Flores a manila envelope, Bobby Flores, which was then turned over to us. It's funny, talking about this with Comrade Don, he says Bobby gave it to him. I remember getting it myself. It was the 1958 Doxey grand jury transcript, only the one. And Don and I opened it together, and somehow we turned right to this passage. Miss Doxey, again, if I can summarize just a bit, you have indicated after going to this Jack's apartment, you then began going to another apartment, the apartment of a woman, yes. And in that apartment, you also met a man whom you know as Sam, yes. And that Sam gave you money and that you typed reports and gave information. I remember Jack giving me money, and I'm pretty sure I must have gotten some from Sam, and that was some years later, but I'm assuming I don't recall it definitely. Do you recall how you knew going to this apartment that you're describing, the woman's apartment? No. Now, you described the mimeograph material which you gave. Can you recall the contents of the material that you typed? Well, I remember I used to just type up. It was mostly during the faction fights in the party and political committee meetings, who was fighting with who. And then if there was correspondence from Leon Trotsky that I saw, I would try to remember what was in the letters and write that all out, who was going with who, and that kind of thing, personal things like that. I remember how much money they had. I knew, bank balances and stuff like that. Well, Comrade Don and I turned to each other reading this together and said, it's her confession, which is exactly what it was. Later that day, we got the 1954 transcript as well. Thank you very much, comrades.